Hi guys, how's it going? We are still talking all things Russian organized crime. Thank you very much for joining me in the second episode of this playlist, Russian organized crime. The newer version of the Russian crime organizations were rising high in the scene just right with the fading of the Soviet Union in its very last days of existence. By the early 1990s, the Mafia and its Russian edition was gathering more recruits, a new generation most needed for the new era that they are about to enter. Many of this new generation of recruits were actually damaged and devastated veterans from the Soviets' last war in Afghanistan. Many veterans ended up joining the Russian underworld after the harsh times they had been through with the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union and the death of the Red Army. Some were bodyguards, some were runners, some were leg breakers, and some had chosen to play hitman. They were specialized in contract killings. During the 90s, the most obvious need in the crime industry were for thugs and leg breakers. For more sophisticated purposes, not least assassinations. Organized crime gangs' best candidates for recruitments were mostly sportsmen and martial artists. Many members of the early gangs had actually come from sports clubs, weightlifters, bodybuilders, and wrestlers. Former members of police force and army, as we said, are always on the very top of the list for most welcomed members to join Russian organized crime. Former members of police force and armed forces were actually the most preferred at all times to join Russian crime organizations at decent positions. Please meet Mr. Alexander Solonik. For the record, he was also known as the Macedonian, the Superkiller, and Alexander the Great. As a child, Mr. Solonik was so fond of martial arts and firearms. Eventually, when he grew up, he joined the Russian armed forces and he was sent in an assignment to be stationed with tanks regiment in East Germany back during the Cold War. Right after the armed forces, Alexander Solonik joined the police force in Russia, but he didn't stay for too long with them. He was fired for being too violent with the suspects. The angry guy ended up going back from Moscow all the way to his old town, Kurgan, where he was desperate to find a job and ended up grave digger. Yes, all the way from an officer in the Soviet army to a grave digger in a remote Russian town. Solonik got married twice when he was back to his town, but in 1987 he was charged with rape and he was sentenced to spend some time in prison. Right from inside the courthouse where he was convicted, Mr. Alexander Solonik managed to run away from the hand of the police. Now the stories made up around Mr. Solonik and his personality are too many and they are not easy to be verified. It all sounded like an action movie that is so fictional. Inside the prison, and after it was known by the inmates that Solonik is a former cop, Solonik was marked for death. Solonik ended up defending himself against 12 inmates trying to take his life. He had proven inside the prison that he is the toughest guy and not to be messed with. Alexander managed after 2 years in captivity to run away from the prison, and he started his new career as a hitman with the Russian underworld organizations. He was the perfect profile Russian Mafia was always looking for. A tough sports guy with experience in the army, he's got a high sense of criminality, and he is running away from the police after he escaped from the prison. He was made a legend. Alexander Solonik had made a long list of successful jobs executed in a short period of time. Early 1990s in Russia was a madness. A crazy war between the gangsters of Russia had broken out, and the blood was everywhere. Alexander Solonik had found a big market, and he was a main player, a gun for hire. He was like a freelancer working with all organizations of crime in Russia and executing his jobs perfectly. In time, Alexander Solonik was wanted badly by the both sides in the scene. The Russian underworld leaders wanted his head at any price, and the law enforcement was looking for him to put him behind bars for all the crimes he had committed. After several failed attempts to catch Solonik, he was caught by the police of Moscow when he was spotted having a drink in a public place with a fellow criminal. He was cornered by the police of Moscow, and after a short gun battle, he ended up being arrested and was taken into custody. Alexander ended up in Moscow's supermax security prison, Metroskaya Tishina, where he was supposed to spend long years for the crimes he had committed. But of course, that wasn't the plan he had for himself. What happened after this was unbelievable. The Hollywood-style escape plan was made possible when Alexander Solonik managed to afford a pistol and climbing equipment. He had placed a mannequin under the blanket on his bed to buy more time so he can make his way from his cell all the way to behind the wall of the supermax security prison of Metroskaya Tishina. What we know about Solonik from the moment he escaped from the supermax security prison all the way to his resurfacing again was very few. He disappeared, he vanished, and no one knew much about him. Later on, Alexander Solonik resurfaced again in Athens, Greece, with a fake passport issued from the Greek consulate in Moscow. It was said that his very first job he had to finish once he arrived in Greece was actually to undergo a plastic surgery to change the features of his face so he can hide behind a new identity. Actually, Alexander Solonik by then was one of the most wanted criminals in Russia, and his name was distributed all over Europe, either in police stations or airports. In Greece, Alexander Solonik had upgraded himself. He is no longer a hitman for hire. He had formed his own crime organization, and he'd recruited 50 criminals to work for him in his new organization that was based on drug trafficking and contracted killings. Contracted killing, particularly at that time, was a flourishing business for criminals because of the war erupted years ago in Russia and was expanded throughout Europe between the leaders of the gangs of the underworld in Russia and across the European continent. Solonik's reputation grew to legendary proportions with public. He'd become a godfather for his own crime organization and managed to make his way to the list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in Russia. But what happened after that was unbelievable. It was a surprise that shocked the crime community in Russia and Greece alike. In February 1997, the Greek authorities came out. They had found the body of the Russian hitman Alexander Solonik. He was apparently strangled to death and was left in a place called Varibum, 25 kilometers away from Athens, the capital city of Greece, without any identification documents on him. Few days after the death of Alexander Solonik, the Greek authorities had found the remains of the Russian model and fashion designer Svetlana Kotova. She was brutally killed and dismembered and buried in a random grave just 300 meters away from the villa where Alexander Solonik used to live. Poor Svetlana was actually 21 years old the day she was killed, and she was apparently in a romantic relationship of some sort with Alexander Solonik. In the weeks following the death of Alexander Solonik, the Greek police had raided a number of villas, either belonging to Alexander Solonik himself or some members of his gang, and an arsenal of weapons was found. Alexander Solonik's solicitor, Mr. Karishev, who attended the police identification of the body of Solonik allegedly and his burial, said that the body that he had himself seen was not looking at all similar to his client, Mr. Solonik, and this is another mystery that was never solved. Solonik's mother, who said to be the person who identified the body, wasn't actually there for his funeral. And ever since, the case of the murder of Alexander Solonik was closed and it was never opened again. Alexander Solonik was born in Russia 1960 and he was killed in Greece 1997. He'd lived 37 years that were full of everything except for peace and real life as it should be. Guys, thank you very much for staying with me that long. It was great to have you watching my video. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video and share it if you don't mind, and please expect me with more stories about Russian organized crime so we can tell more of stories and fill this playlist Russian organized crime. Thank you very much. See you later.